right. Mr. Norris, would you please state your full name and business address for the record?
Yes, my name is Tyler H. Norris, and my business address is 5310 South Olson Avenue, Building 300, Durham, North Carolina, 27713.
Who is your employer and in what capacity do you serve?
I serve as Vice President of Development at Cypress Creek Renewables, and I'm also co-chair of the Clean Power Suppliers Association.
Would you agree that some modeling limitations for solar procurement are appropriate because there are practical limits to the amount of solar that Duke can interconnect each year?
Yes, certainly. And there are uncertainties, of course, in the interconnection of any large-scale generation facility. That will be true for offshore wind. It will be true for small modular reactors or any large-scale generator that we're adding to the system. We believe there are a number of reasons to suspect that the rate of interconnection can be improved over time for a whole host of reasons, some of which I already mentioned earlier. But nevertheless, there is inherent uncertainty in the ultimate rate that can be achieved. And this is also why we think it's prudent, given the cost savings that could be accrued, for this commission to consider incentive mechanisms that we discussed earlier, as well as oversight and accountability that could try to improve those rates of interconnection. We do advise potentially the use of a technical advisory committee, similar to what was used for the solar integration services charge, and to have that report be filed with this commission in the next carbon plan. And depending on the outcome of that report, potentially considering the use of an independent monitor to identify potential ways to improve that rate of interconnection. But ultimately, to your point, there is uncertainty in the rate that can be achieved. And lastly, I'll note, in consideration of this uncertainty, CPSA did not propose that the commission consider resource portfolios without any cap at all on solar and solar plus storage interconnections. It did model out that such a scenario, and it did allow for substantial additional cost savings. But in pursuit of a consensus, CPSA has proposed a more reasonable cap, which does align with the cap that Duke proposes in its P1 portfolio, which increases up to 1,800 megawatts a year by in-service year of 2028.
What risk do you see in the fact that North Carolina is one of the top leaders in installed utility scale solar, but to date have never moved at the pace that would be required for interconnection under that P1? Given that everyone's trying to work on the interconnection problems, and we have every reason to think, that if we can achieve it faster, we will. But what do you see as the risk? Or put another way, is the company correct in its view that there is indeed a risk associated with going on the path of P1?
Thank you for the excellent question. First, it may be worth acknowledging that, of course, as any new technology comes down the cost curve, that almost by definition, if it hasn't been installed before, the rate at which it will be installed or provided by vendors to customers will increase over time. And we saw this in the early years of the development of utility scale solar in North Carolina, where Duke increased its rate of interconnection by 20-fold in a single year in the early 2010s. And they continued to improve the rate of interconnection thereafter, I believe achieving up to approximately 900 megawatts in the late 2010s. The rate did fall thereafter. As I testify, it's our view that that is substantially attributable to the North Carolina law that was passed in 2017, which did make new solar qualifying facilities unfinanceable. So it was, in our view, is more an issue with the supply of new projects than it was with respect to Duke's ability to interconnect at a higher rate. And so, but we think the prior rates of interconnection are instructive. 700 megawatts, 900 megawatts have already been achieved, and they're going to be interconnecting a much, much smaller number of projects in this case. And we admit the ultimate rate at which they will be able to interconnect is uncertain, but we think, again, there are many reasons to believe that they can achieve a higher rate, and that attempting to do so is prudent and reasonable given the likely cost savings that would be accrued for the ratepayers if they can be achieved. The other thing I think that's worth mentioning is we interconnect projects all the time, right? All across the country, every single year, we're interconnecting tens and tens of gigawatts of transmission scale generators. This is not rocket science, right? We know how to build interconnection facilities. Every utility across the country is doing it at a rapid clip, and that clip is going to only increase. We have learnings we'll be able to achieve from other utilities on how they're achieving higher interconnection rates in the years ahead. So we know how to build interconnection facilities. We can do it fast. And then with respect to transmission upgrades, we know that those may take a bit longer, but this utility and all utilities around the country have been doing thermal upgrades to their system for decades and decades and decades. That's what they do. In some sense, that's what they should be the best at, because it's, of course, one of their primary roles to ensure the reliance and the operation and the efficiency of the transmission system. So I think there are a number of other reasons why we believe that a high rate can be achieved. And we're not suggesting that 1,800 megawatts a year necessarily will be achievable. But we think it is worth making the attempt and giving it our best shot.
So I think in a general way, you and I have a similar view that any kind of process, this process, anything we do, there's always room for improvement, and we should always strive to get there. And the Dukes can make those efforts. But what's the risk if we absolutely head out on the P1 path and we don't get there because we find some obstacles that either were unexpected or conditions change or whatever? What's the risk if we don't get there?
Yes, thank you again for the excellent question. I do speak to this some in my testimony, that there are very little downside risks to attempting to achieve a higher rate of interconnection. The first reason is that if those projects can't be interconnected in the year in which we're targeting, they'll be interconnected, and those lower cost megawatt hours will be available to the system as soon as they can be interconnected. And so if that ends up pushing the compliance date out to 2032, that may occur. It may be that the projects in the earlier years end up coming online closer to 2029 or 2030. But the downside risk is simply that they get pushed out by a couple of years. The only other risk I think that Duke discusses that may be applicable here is this hypothetical risk of overpayment if you were to procure those resources earlier. And if you're open to it, I think it might be worth just discussing that, because I think it's very relevant to your question. I think it's worth noting first that the risk of overpayment is much higher for immature emerging technologies than it is for technologies that are more mature and established, like solar PV and lithium-ion batteries, which, as you're aware, 500 gigawatts hours of batteries, lithium-ion batteries delivered globally. Last year, 5 gigawatts installed in the United States just for the purposes of grid storage. And so that risk is much higher when it comes to attempting to achieve early interconnection of SMRs or offshore wind or other potential resources. So that risk is already in place. When I discussed in my testimony, when we look at NREL's cost forecast for solar and solar plus storage, there is relatively equivalent probability in the likelihood that you'll get prices that are above in service year 2026 from 2032 or below. And those risks are relatively equivalent. In the case of solar only, there's it's about a 10% potential cost premium from 2026 to 2032, and then a potential 10% decrease on their moderate scenario. And then we see similar levels for solar plus storage. So we think that this risk of overpayment is relatively low and balance a consideration of the evidence.
On the same line of questioning about procuring solar early, the company responded to one aspect in terms of advances in technology being lost because you procure early, and gave a specific example of the fixed panels versus the ones that can tilt and track the sun. So if we had procured earlier, you could lose the benefit of such advances. Do you have a response to to that in terms of it not being harmful to ratepayers to procure early?
Yes, thank you. I do think, again, back to the cost forecast, there are factors on either side, right, that could lead to a cost increase over time or cost decrease. We are not aware of any evidence presented in this proceeding by any party that there are potential technological breakthroughs in solar photovoltaics or even lithium-ion batteries that is likely to significantly change that range of potential variance. And I think I testify that, we're not aware of any credible market forecast that doesn't show crystalline silicon technology and existing thin film, dominating solar photovoltaic market in the United States for the next decade. And so we think, this is highly speculative, right, as to whether there could be a breakthrough technology that could substantially change that range of variance and potential costs. And of course, this, I don't want to be repetitive in making the point, but I just think it's so important on a relative basis here. When we step back and we say, what are the other resources available at our disposal to achieve the carbon reduction target? We're talking about potential small modular nuclear reactors, being a first mover to achieve those for entry in 2032. There is no doubt, and I don't think any intervener or Duke would contest this, that the benefits of delaying SMR procurement are likely to be much, much greater than for any potential delay in solar photovoltaics or lithium-ion battery storage, because it's almost certain that those costs will decline over time as that technology comes down the cost curve.
But it is your testimony that solar is a maturing, it's still advancing, correct? As a technology.
I believe I testify that at least for solar photovoltaics and crystalline silicon technology, that it is a fully mature technology at this point. And by, we can sort of debate what exactly do we mean by mature, but we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of gigawatts having been deployed around the country now, rates of additions in the United States now around 20 gigawatts a year, contributing, nearly 4% of all US electricity, nearly 8% of all the electricity on the system here now is provided by solar PV. And these systems have been tested. All right, they've been in operation for years now, and so we've been able to observe their operational risks and limitations.
All right, thank you.
Can you point or identify a very specific procedure or practice that you've encountered in another state that you would think that would be, we could import here? I'm assuming because your company does work all over the country, just something specific.
Sure. It may be worth noting, I'm sure the commission is aware that we are seeing very high rates of interconnection for solar and solar plus storage at utility scale in other states. And ERCOT, I believe, achieved a rate of addition of in the range of 4,000 megawatts just last year. They're already achieving those rates. There's a lot more flexibility in terms of the ability to add resources to the system there. There's a lot more transparency in the interconnection study process and the identification of congested zones that allows for interconnection customers to better position their projects in locations that are less likely to trigger upgrades. And so the more transparency that's available to developers and to all stakeholders, the more likely it is that we can position projects in locations that will avoid substantial upgrades. So I think ERCOT is an excellent example, and I think there are a lot of learnings to be had from that. And of course, they've also done proactive transmission planning and development. You may be aware of the CREZ project that they proactively built out to gain access to ultra low cost utility scale solar resources in the western part of the state. I know there's been significant discussion here of CAISO and the transparency that they make available to on their system. They're of course achieving much higher rates of solar interconnection annually than we are. And by the way, their system is not that much larger than the combined system of DEC and DEP, at least on a peak perspective. So I think those are at least two examples that we would point to.
When, just one follow-up. When you say transparency, I mean, that sounds good, but are you talking about maps or are you what's a specific example
Yeah.
that you're seeing in these other states that you're not seeing here?
Yes. Simply put, we cannot replicate the power flow modeling that Duke performs when they provide us an interconnection study that's specific to our projects. It is extremely difficult to gain information on how those studies are conducted. It is effectively impossible, according to actually CPSA witness Ryan Watts, to replicate them. Whereas in other states and jurisdictions with more transparency, we can fully replicate, in many cases, the results of their power flow analysis.
Okay, that's what I was looking for. Thanks.
And how would you describe storage, paired with solar? Because I think that we would not consider it to be like standalone solar as being a more mature technology.
Thank you, Commissioner, for the excellent question. First, I think it is worth discussing the maturity of lithium-ion batteries, because while they may not have been installed at a significant volume to date within Duke's system, there are other reasons for that, primarily due to the limited nature of the rate structure, which we previously discussed, and the limited nature of the existing procurements that have been conducted. So just to recap, lithium-ion batteries are a very, very well-established mature technology. I believe that every person in this room right now has a lithium-ion battery in your pocket that you rely upon day in and day out for all of your communications. 500 gigawatt hours of lithium-ion batteries were shipped globally last year. That is expected to increase significantly in years ahead. Global manufacturing capacity could, by some projections, increase by an order of magnitude by 2030. And in the United States alone, just last year, I believe there were nearly 4 gigawatts of additional lithium-ion batteries installed to the United States electrical power grid, so bringing the total to 5 gigawatts. So these are well-established, mature technologies. They simply have not achieved uptake within Duke's system because of the limited nature of the rate structure and the procurement structures to date. So when we look at the cost forecast for solar plus storage, similarly, as I discussed on solar only, so for NREL's, again, annual technology baseline forecast that I believe all, if not most, interveners here are relying upon, and we look at that cost forecast from 2026 out to 2030 or 2032, the variance, again, on a nominal basis, demonstrates that the costs could actually be higher between 2026 to 2032, according to their conservative forecast, or they could be lower based on their moderate forecast or their aggressive forecast, which we do not view as realistic for this system. And so for that reason, it's our view that those probabilities are relatively equivalent. We could debate, is it weighted 40 to 60% in one direction or 30 to 70? But generally, it's our view that there is risk in both directions, and we can consider a variety of different factors. No doubt, the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act is going to put meaningful upward pressure on demand for those resources all around the country. That could put constraint on supply chains. And so for that reason, it's our view that this very similar principle applies with respect to the overpayment risk on solar plus storage as applies to solar only resources. And I fully understand that, again, because there hasn't been very substantial uptake of battery storage in this market yet, that it may seem like a relatively new technology, but it's being used all around the country. To provide more information on its utilization, we're more than happy to do that. But I do want to take this opportunity to address what I believe is a misleading comparison of execution risk in Duke's carbon plan, suggesting that battery storage carries a similar execution risk to small modular nuclear reactors. They lump them into the same category called new to Carolinas resources. And we think this is just a fundamental mischaracterization of the execution risks around battery storage as compared to SMRs.
Okay, thank you. Just to follow up on that, I think Duke's position about both solar and then specifically about solar plus storage would be kind of an advancing technology, and that there would be financial risk to customers if if solar was over procured. So what I'm hearing is that you don't agree with Duke's position, that there would be financial risk to customers because storage is this advancing technology.
Well, I think it's our view that the risk of overpayment by procuring early for storage is relatively minimal because there's a risk that the costs actually increase over time. There's also a meaningful possibility that they decrease over time. We cannot say with certainty right now, and there are reasons to believe that it could go in either direction. But this viewpoint that cost reductions are 100% assured or very likely, we think is not accurate. And again, we have seen some cost increases occur over the past decade, in particular instances due to macroeconomic factors, and those may occur again. But I think if we step back in terms of the overall carbon plan and how we're going to achieve compliance with the interim carbon reduction target, the risk of overpayment by pursuing early procurement of these resources, we believe, is much smaller than the risk of having to pay for much more expensive technologies with much higher execution risk to achieve that compliance target if we cannot install this level of solar and solar plus storage, right? So if we take a step back and we look at what's the overall cost risk here, if we don't pursue near-term procurement, we think there's very significant cost risk as a result of not pursuing that near-term procurement.
Okay, and then I guess my last question is what you're saying is that you don't view that there's really substantial risk to ratepayers for over procuring, but you're also saying that you believe that there's, with my hypothetical of that that there would be over procurement of solar, I think you're saying that you believe that there would be benefits to and I'm talking about to customers, ratepayers, for this hypothetical of over procuring solar. And is that correct? And if so, what benefits are you talking about to customers for over procuring?
Right. One, over procuring, pursuing a more ambitious near-term procurement. So I think the most significant implication for the ratepayers is that if we do not pursue a more ambitious near-term procurement goal, we will be forced to rely on more expensive technologies for purposes of achieving the 70% target. And Brattle's analysis, I think, really underscores this, in that if we apply Duke's low default solar interconnection rate and we don't pursue larger near-term procurement, the model is forced to select other technologies to achieve compliance. Again, they carry higher cost and higher execution risk. So hundreds of millions of dollars per year in additional costs required, and then cumulative impact of billions of dollars by 2035. So I think that's really the greatest cost risk, is that, and by the way, I think it is worth noting in this context, and we discuss it at length, is that Duke's proposed near-term solar and solar plus storage procurement plan does not allow for compliance by 2030. They are wholly inconsistent in terms of the volumes proposed. And I want to elaborate on this point. It really is important, and it's confusing too. So Duke represents that 5,400 megawatts of solar plus storage, of new solar plus storage, will be online by beginning of year 2030 for purposes of compliance under P1. They actually have a meaningfully larger amount of solar and solar plus storage dispatching in calendar year 2030 for purposes of compliance. According to our analysis, it's more in the range of 6,100 megawatts of solar and solar plus storage are online in the system. It's because those come online closer to mid-year rather than beginning of year. So at minimum, according to their own P1, we need at least 6,100 megawatts of solar and solar plus storage online operating in 2030 for purposes of compliance. Their near-term execution plan does not support that. And we go through the timelines required for the interconnection, but there is very significant risk that if we pursue 3,100 megawatts, that from the outset, effectively, we will be excluding the possibility of achieving compliance by 2030.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you speak to me about, I see some tension in your testimony with respect to meeting the 2030 goal and then the increase in solar plus storage. And I'm making the assumption that when you have solar plus storage, that there's going to be more complications with and more time spent on the interconnection of that resource. I mean, would you agree with that assumption, first of all?
Respectfully, Commissioner, I think that may not necessarily be the case, and if you'll allow me to just discuss that briefly.
And before you start,
yeah.
and so that is the question, that if these resources take longer, how do you reach that timeline by 2030? But please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Well, the first thing to recognize is it's a great benefit in terms of the ability to pair the storage with the solar, and that we are saving on interconnection resources and interconnection capacity. So again, first, we're saving on the costs of any additional interconnection facilities or upgrades, again, because we don't have to increase the capacity necessarily of the combined system. The storage capacity is under the nameplate rating of the overall solar facility. So you're inherently saving on interconnection costs, and you're saving on the limited interconnection capacity that's available to the system. And so this gets back to the question of how do you determine actually how much to pursue in terms of standalone, because by separating it, right, you are necessarily requiring the use of additional limited interconnection capacity on the system. So in a sense, I think you could argue that by being able to pair this resource that provides on-peak capacity to the system with a generator, in particular a zero carbon generator that's readily available in the near term, that is arguably a way of accelerating the rate of interconnection, right? Because we're able to save on interconnect capacity and interconnection costs. So, and I didn't discuss this earlier as a way to accelerate the rate of interconnection, but in a sense, I think you can think of pairing the storage with the solar as a way of achieving higher rates of interconnection.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. And then my last question is, I heard you testify that cost for storage, could go in either direction. And I think I did hear the answer to the question I'm about to ask, but I'm going to ask it again just for clarification. So, there's the thought that if it can go in either direction, and if there is limited interconnection ability, why not wait until it can safely be interconnected or quickly be interconnected? Why procure and not know if it's going to go up or down? Why not wait until we know that it will be interconnected quickly?
Thank you. Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that again, because according to NREL's own cost forecast, there's a meaningful likelihood that the cost of those resources will increase between 2026 and 2030 or 2032. That by delaying procurement, we actually could end up having to pay more just for the resource itself as a result of that delay. So again, there's a meaningful risk that could occur. With respect to the rates of interconnection, this is one of the central worries, is that if we procrastinate on procurement, then we only increase the rate at which we would have to interconnect those resources in later years to achieve a compliance scenario that is substantially dependent upon that, right? So if we defer the procurement later, then we're going to have to achieve an even higher rate of interconnection in 2029 or 2030 for purposes of 2030 compliance, or in 2030 and 31 for purposes of 2032 compliance. So in a sense, delaying the procurement increases the necessary interconnection rate later, which increases execution risk. And so we think that should be taken into account.
Thank you.
Let's start out with 1A. You want to add CPSA 3 and CPSA 5 to the carbon plan that's been proposed by Duke. What do you think the advantages would be of adding those specific portfolios as you've recommended? Be
Yes.
very precise.
Yes. So CPSA 3 provides for 2030 compliance with a reasonable interconnection cap on solar and solar plus storage that aligns with Duke's rate of 1,800 megawatts a year starting in 2028. And it increases the rate of interconnection for the first 2 years up to 1,500 megawatts a year. And the cost savings as compared to the alternative scenario with a lower interconnection rate equivalent to Duke's default cap, I believe that the cost difference ends up being on a cumulative basis, billions of dollars by 2035. It is hundreds of millions of dollars on an annual basis. And so CPSA 3, we think, according to Brattle's analysis, is the least cost pathway to achieving compliance by 2030 if a higher rate of interconnection of these resources can be achieved. And so we think it is prudent to add that and to align the near-term execution plan with that portfolio. With respect to CPSA 5, it provides for a compliance date of 2032, also with the higher rate of interconnection. And it also, of course, selects a substantially larger volume of solar and solar plus storage. And we think it also mitigates execution risk for a whole host of reasons. It doesn't rely on achieving the installation of a small modular nuclear reactor in 2032 for purposes of compliance. It also does put downward pressure on other resources with higher costs and execution risk. And so we are, as you know, we're not suggesting that these are the only portfolios that we should be working towards as part of the near-term execution plan, but that it is reasonable to include them as one portfolio, or in this case, two portfolios that the near-term execution plan should support.
Can you talk to me about, Duke has responded about the volume adjustment mechanism. So can you speak to us about the volume adjustment mechanism and how that might address some of the concerns that you've stated today?
Thank you for the excellent question. First, I want to say that we recognize that there are legitimate concerns about the cost of these resources and where the average cost of each procurement will land. And we want to work with the stakeholders and commission to achieve the least cost outcome. And that's really what's motivated a lot of our testimony, is achieving a least cost outcome. With respect to the specifics of a volume adjustment mechanism. So in the context of the compliance plan, it is true that there's a certain cost point, right, at which we would not procure additional solar and solar plus storage resources. The question is, what is that cost point? And so in the way that HB 951 is structured, if there is a tipping point, right, there's a cost threshold at which solar or solar plus storage theoretically could go so high that we would pursue procurement of other higher cost resources. And so I think the question upon us is to figure out, what is that cost threshold? What's the tipping point, right, where you would pursue procurement of other resources instead of that solar and solar plus storage? It is based on Brattle's analysis, that cost threshold is very, very high, because the only other resource that is comparable in cost is onshore wind. And I think every intervener and stakeholder in this proceeding has recognized there are very significant limitations on a site, from a siting perspective, what can be achieved for onshore wind. And so once you exhaust the onshore wind, the only available next resources available at scale are potentially offshore wind and small modular nuclear reactors, both of which carry much, much higher costs. So from a proper methodological standpoint, we would figure out what is that tipping point in cost, and we would establish a volume adjustment mechanism around that, or simply say that is a firm cost cap at which we would not procure additional solar and solar plus resources. So I think that's the way you might want to approach the question of what's the cost threshold. Some other challenges with this volume adjustment mechanism is, so the cost at which it's set is arbitrary, and that it is based on whatever cost assumption Duke happened to use for purposes of its carbon planning, right? So they select, I believe it was a somewhat adjusted version of NRL-ATB, right? So it's arbitrary based on whatever they assumed for their cost forecast. So it's arbitrary in that respect. It's arbitrary with respect to the thresholds at which the volume adjustment mechanism is triggered, right? Which is 10% in either direction. We're not aware of any specific basis for choosing 10%, again, from an overall resource planning perspective under this carbon compliance regime. And then it's also arbitrary with respect to the actual volume adjustment of 20% in either direction. Again, what is the basis for selecting 20% over any other number? So it is our view that the current volume adjustment mechanism is flawed. I think we ultimately came around to supporting it for the limited purposes of the 2022 procurement, again, just because we all had to move very quickly to get this in place. But we think it would be prudent to consider a more accurate and reasonable volume adjustment mechanism for purposes of next year's procurement in 2024 and beyond.
It's my observation that certain of those projects that seeking to interconnect in red zones who have made the case to the commission that those locations geographically, not in terms of point of interconnection, but geographically are high viability, I think is what I'm seeing now, is what we're calling those areas, high viability for solar. When those projects are asked to assume the costs that they impose on the transmission network, the project economics, at least in recent years, don't support development of those projects. Is that a correct observation?
Yes.
On my part, okay. And so if we help me work through this tension that exists in my mind between the concept and the statutory mandate of least cost development of resources, and this sort of other concept of proactive investment in transmission to facilitate the generation, the development of generation, and then sort of this burgeoning concept that we're talking about of integrated transmission and generation planning. If we are to drive towards the least cost resources for purposes of compliance with this carbon plan, how do we do that if we remove the signal or the incentive for those resources to find the locations, find the points of interconnection on the Duke systems that are the least cost, that are the most efficient or the least expensive points of interconnection in terms of costs that they're going to impose on the transmission network? Is my question clear? I recognize that was a long preamble, but
That's an excellent question. We are at 10:40. I may
Just-
not be able to answer it in 1
you can
minute.
respond and then we'll come back.
Okay. It's a very good question, and this will be somewhat nuanced, so I appreciate you bearing with it. So I think first it is important to recognize that a very substantial portion of the projects that are in the 2022 procurement are located in the red zone. I think there's approximately 1,500 megawatts that are outside it, and the rest are within it. And you can argue that, developers have had years to go and find sites elsewhere. If they were able to find an ample supply of competitive sites outside the red zone, one would think they would have already done so, and you'd see a larger supply. It is true.
But Mr. Norris, I'm going to interrupt you there and then I'll let you keep going. But those projects that have attempted to develop in the red zone, is it not a fair assumption that they've invested significant cost in the development of those projects? So there's every reason not to just go and look for other sites, irrespective of the guidance the commission has provided and orders that it's finished, that is issued?
Sure. But remember, of course, there are multiple developers, and those developers have resources to pursue site acquisition, irrespective of how much they may have sunk into existing projects, right? And they have every incentive to do so, right? If they were to believe that a procurement would occur that would favor the non-red zone. So I think 1,500 megawatts has shown up. Now, it's also true the market signal from H951 was only sent at the end of last year. So there has been a limited amount of time to fully respond. I think there's no doubt we will see more projects show up in next year's procurement that are currently outside the red zone. But from an aggregate perspective, we're looking at the overall volume that anyone is proposing as a minimum for purposes of least cost compliance, even assuming conservative transmission costs. that we are going to need access to that high concentration of competitive projects in the red zone. And as you know, Commissioner Duke did assume the full cost allocation that you mentioned in their modeling for the solar cost. It was 17 cents a watt, which I believe they pulled from the cost allocation from the red zone. And so that's already baked into the least cost economic optimization modeling.
Motion.
All right, with that, Mr. Norris, you may be excused and step down. Thank you very much, sir, for your testimony today.
Thank you.